All right. So as I stated, what I'd like to hit on for especially dealing with early childhood is socio-emotional development. And just to remind everybody of some of the reviews that we know about early childhood. Uh, Early childhood goes from about 0 to 6. If you're an early childhood educator, it goes from 0 to 8 because you need that transition period between 6 and 8. So if you're interested in the field of early childhood education, you'll study children from 0 to 8 and taking into account transitions. Um, as noted earlier in the course, this is a unique period of development because we are actually physically developing our brain in a socio-cultural context instead of the nourishing womb of the mother. And that's one of the unique things about being humans. There's some other species that are born the same way, but it's pretty unique for humans, and that the amount of brain that physically develops between the age of 0 and 6. As I've mentioned before, there are some very unique things about infancies that we haven't understood. We know they are really good at math and statistics. They have probability skills that adults lose over time. They have the ability to determine the difference between people that would be good for them and people that would be bad for them. Um, and as early as I believe 4 to 6 months is as early as that research goes. And we know that, so what I'm trying to get at is we know that infancy, even in infancy, we're dealing with a very complex individual. The traditional idea that infants were born kind of just blank and had no resources other than wanting to feed and warm themselves through the mother's resources. We're finding that infancy is much, much more complex. And in a lot of ways, we should start to capitalize on that complexity of infancy, because it's believed the reason we lose our probability and mathematical skills, our ability to tell the difference between those who would be good for us and those would be bad for us, is when we develop language. We learn that out of the children. So, mom and dad start talking about how much they despise mathematics. Or maybe they've learned a differentiation between those who would be healthy and not healthy for them. And they start teaching that child the differentiation between those. So I think with the developing knowledge we have about infancy, that hopefully someday it will change the way we treat young children and the way we socialize them, so that we can actually gain on those that complexity of the infant. So we know they have a complex world, and that complex world continues as they start to develop into language and their social world. And we will see this complexity, but there is a few things that we need to kind of clarify before moving on. And that's really, when we're talking about socio-emotional, we need to talk about the difference between emotions and feelings. Okay. And this is just for academic purposes. I know that in our popular culture, we intermix the word emotion with feelings, and we kind of intermix those, and that's fine. Even in a lot of the clinical literature, it will kind of combine the two and whatnot. So in language wise, it's okay to intermix feelings and emotions. This is for more academic reasons that I want to separate the two, because it's two very unique processes. So when we talk about emotions, at least for the sake of academia, what we're talking about is the body's physiological reaction to a situation, and that cognitive interpretation of the situation and communicates to other people's actions. Emotions basically have two purposes. One is to alert the person that there's something right or wrong in their environment, and it's used as a social mechanism to allow everybody else to know what's alerting you in the situation. So if it's something that it brings up fear, we have certain facial expressions. If it brings up, and then we have certain hormones and whatnot that run through the body that signal us that there's something wrong. So that's emotions. And then we have feelings. Feelings kind of get to this thing about emotions, and this is where these can kind of get intermixed. But the way I want you to think about feelings for this academic discussion is feelings is our interpretation of emotions, okay? And it's really important to understand these as two separate entities, okay? So we have an emotion, and then as we develop language, we start to interpret that emotion, okay? And then just two other basic concepts is affect, which is our general mood. When you think about mood and what mood you're in today, that's generally seen as affect. When we talk about feelings and emotions, these are what's called situationally bound, okay? So we all have a basic affect. So, you know, sleepiness, awakeness, good mood, bad mood, those are all affect. But the situation, depended upon whether it brings up positive emotions or negative emotions, are situationally bound. They only occur within the situation, okay? And then emotional schemas, which is important for us to talk about, is the interpretation of the association between emotions and feelings. This is what we set up in our mind as what we should be experiencing, okay? I think another good way of putting it is emotions play out in the theater of the body. So it's the physical reaction to some stimuli, and feelings play out in the theater of the mind, okay? Meaning that it's that cognitive processing of an event that brought up a certain emotion, okay? Now, why is it important for us to separate emotions and feelings? And that's because, especially in early childhood, when children are learning language, it's very easy to get emotions mislabeled, okay? And so probably the best example is in my clinical years, I worked with a lot of domestic violence survivors, and a lot of them were frustrated because they kept getting into these negative, bad relationships, and they wanted to know, where is the good guys in the world? Where are they? And because they never can find them. Okay. Now, I'm going to go back to early childhood to kind of explain this. Remember that one of our most basic drives is to make our world consistent and predictable. Okay. Keep that in mind. We want our world to be consistent and we want it to be predictable. All right. So what was very common for these children is for these young women was that they had very abusive parents. Okay. Now I want you to go back to emotional schemas. The schema of the person who is supposed to be the most caring and loving of you in the world. And we're socialized into this idea that a mom, okay, mom equals love, okay? Very poor heart, I apologize about that. Okay, mom equals love because she represents caring, she represents support, she represents comfort, she represents all of these different things. And that's what we represent in our cognitive structure in life is we're told by our neighbors and our family and our churches and our schools that mom is love, okay? Now, however, that doesn't always play out emotionally. So let's take a young child who is developing these concepts, these schemas, and let's say the mother is very abusive. Let's say Mother is very inconsistent. Mother is hurtful, abusive. Okay. What the child is learning in the interpretation of emotions is that abuse equals, whoops, equals, I got to get better at this, you guys, equals, and I'll try to do another heart, abuse equals love, because that's the schema that they're building based on the representation of mom. Okay. Now, the other thing that is occurring is this interpretation is what becomes predictable. Remember those words, predictable and consistent in the child's life. They can control this in a sense. It makes sense to them. All right. And these schemas become very ingrained in young children. Okay. And I'll go back to the example of working with young women who continually came to me and said, Curtis, I just keep getting in relationships. And usually it would happen right when they're getting over their previous domestic violence relationship. And they're getting ready to kind of enter the world again and get back out there and try to find a good relationship. And they often come and say, I'm afraid that I'll just end up with another abusive person. And really, the advice that was given is then date someone who makes you uncomfortable. Okay. Because usually in these situations, the person that makes them uncomfortable is really over here. And I want you to think about this as a representation and the reasons why we have to separate feelings and emotions. If abuse equals love, and that's what's learned from us from our parents and our environment, then someone being caring, being thoughtful, being emotionally supportive is not predictable. And to us, to the individual, it's not consistent. And so we will emotionally avoid those situations where we actually feel those types of emotions because they're so foreign to us and they don't match our schema. Okay. And so, yes, so for a lot of women, I encourage them to, date someone who doesn't make them comfortable. And I will tell you that had relative success. A few of my most severely abused females last time, abuse survivors, I should say, one became a very successful teacher and a very happy relationship and those types of things. But she admitted to me 4 or 5 years down the road into this relationship that it took her 4 to 5 years to redefine what was comfortable and what was predictable, and to really become comfortable with the idea of having that type of relationship in their life. Okay. And so this is why I'm bringing this up, is that language matters, especially in early childhood. And that it is so important, if you're going to be an educator, a mother, a father, that you provide the proper labels for children's experiences, and that you provide those over and over and over and consistently over and over and over. And then when you see children misinterpret emotions, providing them with that language to understand it is really important. Okay. So this is why, especially in early childhood, we academically separate the ideas of emotions and feelings, because sometimes those two can be counterly defined. They can be mislabeled in a lot of ways. So kind of keep those things in mind. Okay. So what type of emotions do we develop, especially early on in infancy? Okay, so what are we born with, and what do we develop within those first couple years? Well, we know that at present at birth, we know that there's a neonatal smile, a startle response, distress, and disgust. Okay. These are very present. The reason why we call it the neonatal smile is because we're not sure, because it happens randomly. We're not sure where the neonatal smile comes from. A lot of people have argued that it's gas. But we do know at the time of birth that there is the remnants of smiling, which is important, and that we see interest in gaze studies, and we know that there is distress and disgust through crying. And you know, if you've ever put a little piece of lemon or something on a little infant's tongue, they definitely have a disgust response. So around 4 to 6 weeks of development, we start to see the neonatal smile turn into a social smile. This is when infants start to smile mostly when they have mom or dad around or their primary caregiver. And they start to mimic their environment. So parents laugh, while the parents laugh or smile, the infant starts to smile or laugh at around 4 to 6 weeks. Okay. The next emotion, and it's very important to understand that these grow out of disgust, and distress, and that's anger, surprise, and sadness. Okay. Believe it or not, there is an association between a person's gag response and emotions of things like anger, surprise, and even fear. Okay, is that people who have a low gag response tend to be more mellow. They tend to have more more melancholy type of emotions. They just tend to be kind of like the chill person. People with quick gag responses tend to be very easily angered, surprised, and have fear. And the reason is that in the neocortex that kind of regulates these areas, is that the areas that respond when you put something in your mouth that isn't edible and you instantly try to get rid of it, is the same area associated with things like disgust, surprise, and sadness on the social level. Meaning that when you find someone kind of annoying, or someone you find is disgusting in a sense, the area that is associated with your gag response is also associated with that emotion as well. So we know these grow out of physiological occurrences. At around 5 to 7 months, we see the development of fear. And we know that fear needs to be present for the development of shame and shyness. Okay. Now, I want to make something clear, because a lot of times I get asked, does this have anything to do with extroversion and introversion? Okay. And I want to explain this, especially the notion of shyness, how quiet a child is, or the like, or how outgoing they are. Okay. I want to make it really clear that extroversion and introversion is a personality feature of how people deal with information. Okay. For extroverts, they have a high need for external stimulation when they're trying to think something through. So they have to talk it out with someone. They have to be around people and have lots of words and things being said. Someone who is highly introverted has to process information more internally. They have to access that information and kind of go on their own and kind of process it. Okay. Indeed, I think I mentioned in this class once, I'm actually extremely introverted. After a class, I have to spend about 45 minutes just sitting in a quiet room thinking and processing everything that I just went through with the class. Neither one, extroversion or introversion, actually have much to do with the need for socialization. Indeed, most introverts have the need to be social just as much as extroverts do. It's just for introverts, they can go into a situation and just be happy being there in that social situation. For extroverts, they have to be engaged in that social situation. The reason why I bring this up is a lot of individuals confuse introversion with shyness. Shyness is what a lot of people actually think introversion is. Shyness is this aversion and fear to social situations and social places. It is the wanting to stay away from people because of feelings of anxiety. And this is why we say, it grows out of fear. So introverts, it has to do with the need to process information internally, but most introverts are not shy. They still need to go out into the world and be there. It's just a different way of relating to the world. Shyness, when you're dealing with someone who is shy, this is someone who has a fear of the social world. And it brings up great anxiety. And it's important to differentiate those things when you're looking at how individuals respond to a situation, okay? But this occurs between 6 to 8 months of development, okay? And then our last set of emotions appears around 2 years of age, where we start to see contempt and guilt. So this is when children often will start, someone takes their toy and they'll try to get some type of quote unquote revenge for that taking of the toy. This is where children start to question whether what they're doing is right or wrong. And that's the form of guilt, okay? So, but if you look at these, this is the wide range of human emotions. And keep in mind, the opposite of these is that positive end of emotion. So sadness versus happiness, surprise versus contempt, anger versus mellowness, I forget the word. And so just keep this in mind, but these are kind of, when we're talking about disgust, sadness, fear, shyness, remember that is what the amygdala responds to. Okay, the amygdala doesn't respond to the happiness emotion, but it will respond to the emotion of sadness. Okay, so that's why we put them kind of in this negative terminology as far as explanation. Okay, so does anybody have any questions about the emergence of these different emotions? Okay, thanks, Abby. Anna, Jordan, thank you. Okay. All right, so we'll move on. Thank you, Brian. Okay. So I want to talk about some different things that is going to go into a very important development early on in early childhood, which is called theory of mind. But I want to talk about just some basic concepts before we get into this conversation. And just really quick as definitions, when we talk about social referencing, it's using the reactions of others to determine how to react in ambiguous situations. And we start to see this develop around 18 months of age and on. Empathy is sharing feelings with other people, okay? So it's feeling bad for someone or feeling bad with someone, okay? And these all have some unique developmental periods that we call 3 to 4 months, okay? And as this also suggests, social referencing we see starts at around 3 to 4 months with mothers, okay? And we call this the mother-infant dance. I kind of explained this when we were talking about Erickson's theory with trust versus mistrust, where the mom feeds, they have a moment, the infant learns this is how mom responds when I respond, and we have these moments together. Okay, so we know it starts with moms around 3 to 4 months, and then it starts with others a little bit later in development, starting around 18 to 24 months. Okay, all right. So I want to talk about an important theory, which is theory of mind. Okay. So on the most basic end, what is theory of mind? Theory of mind is a unique, almost unique human ability. There are some other species that we do theory of mind tests on. We know elephants probably do. Primates show these tasks very well. Dolphins have this ability as well. But it's something very unique to highly emotionally driven species like humans. Okay. And theory of mind is the ability to understand that you are separate from everyone else, and that you may be having a good experience, but the person sitting next to you may be having a negative experience, and that's okay. And cognitively, what this allows us to do is to kind of do, and this is why it's called theory of mind, it kind of allows us to kind of be investigators of why that person is behaving or acting the way they are due to the situation. So, a common example is if I were to, this was a live class and I was just to jump up on a table and start dancing, everyone would be looking at me. You would be doing social referencing with everyone else to try and figure out why the crazy professor just got on top of a table and started dancing. Okay. This is the most basic example of theory of mind. Okay. And there's two biological systems that need to exist for theory of mind to develop. Okay. One is what's called the mirror neuroning system, and the other one is called the mentalizing system. Okay. Mirror neurons are a unique set of neurons in the nervous system that mimic the actions of people we pay attention to. Okay. And it's literally mimicking. So let's say you're sitting down with your friend and your friend is telling you a really sad story. And you're paying attention, of course. Well, the neurons that are firing in your friend's head as they're telling you these stories, if you're paying attention, those same neurons will start to fire in your head. Okay. It's kind of this kind of cool thing. It's how human beings naturally sync up with each other. And the system that connects us with each other, at least on a physical level. Okay. Another good example of mirror neurons, if you're ever at a movie, and if you're, a social scientist like me, you kind of sometimes find yourself watching the crowd more than the movie. And you'll notice in a movie theater, when there's a high action scene where there's a lot of movement, let's say a car chase or something, you will notice that when the actor tilts left, the audience will kind of tilt left. And then when the actor tilts right. And then when you see them dodge a bullet, everybody kind of crawls down and hides. Okay. This is because, and research on this is when that action was being played by the stunt person. We have found that the neurons that were firing in the stunt person, even though it's a recorded scene, but you're still watching it, those neurons that were firing in that stunt person's brain while they were doing that stunt start to fire in the audience's brain as they're viewing what's going on in the movie. Okay. This is the mirror neuroning system, but it works on the physical level. Mirror neurons work on the physical level, meaning that it gives us the physical sensations of what we're paying attention to is important. Okay. Just behind our mirror neuron system, we have what's called the mentalizing system. The mentalizing system is taking on it's seeing these neurons fire, and it's going and it's saying, okay, what is the experience that the person is having? And this is where the brain starts to interpret, this is an action scene versus a person riding a bike scene, as an example. This is where this is saying that this person is in distress versus this person is telling us a very happy story. Okay. These systems start to become very developed around the 18th to 24-month mark. Okay. They're present actually in womb, but they become very active around 18 to 24 months of development. Okay. And at around this time, around about 24 months, to about 36 months, something unique happens. And I'm going to explain it using what are called theory of mind tasks. And I have the two basic, this in this example up down here, these are the two most basic types of theory of mind tasks. Okay. In task 1, what we're going to do is while the infant is sleeping, we're going to put an odorless dye on their forehead. And when the infant awakes, we're going to show the infant a mirror. Okay. And what we're looking for is the infant to recognize that there's something different on their forehead. And so usually they'll start to rub it or whatnot. Infants start to do this around 24 to 36 months. Other species have earlier or later developmental periods, but again, it's limited to some of the more emotional type of species, such as elephants. Okay. And so that's task 1. What is this testing? It's testing for what we call self-awareness. Do people recognize themselves as themselves? Okay. I know there's pet owners in the rooms, and I do apologize to say this, your dogs and cats fell horribly at this task. They don't have the ability to look in a mirror and say, oh, that's me. But I know with my pets, I assume that they do anyways. But that's just an example of differentiation between species. Okay, the other task is a task to recognize whether or not people have similar or different experiences than ourselves. Okay, so the simplest task, and like I said, there's like 16 of these different type of tasks to test this, is you have 2 children in a room. In front of the children, you have 2 cups, and you have maybe a little rubber ball. Okay, in front of the 2 children, let's label the cups A and B. In front of the children, you put the rubber ball in cup A. Okay, and then you have the other child leave the room. Okay, and then in front of the child that is still there, you take the little rubber ball out of cup A and put it into cup B. Okay, and then you ask the child, when the other child returns, should the child look in cup A or cup B? Okay, so this is the paradigm. Now, sometime around 24 to 36 months, the child appropriately states, well, they weren't here when you put the ball in A to B. That was my experience. They'll look in cup A. Children under the age of 24 to 36 months will assume that the child will look in cup B. Okay, what's going on here? Well, in the situation of children recognizing that the child should look in cup A, they're taking on the perspective of the other child's experience. Okay. But before 24 to 36 months, children fail to take on the idea that other children have experiences that they don't. So they inappropriately assume, well, I was here, the kid should look in cut B, no duh, because that's where it's at. And that's what my experience is. Okay. And so what is happening around the 24 to 36 months is, and this is the basis of theory of mind, is that we recognize that we have our own emotions, feelings, and thoughts, and that those emotions, feelings, and thoughts are separate from other people's emotions, feelings, and thoughts. Okay. If you think about this, and it's kind of cool that it occurs during this period and it's a developmental thing, is what the child is learning is the basis of human empathy. The ability to recognize that other people have their own emotions, their own thoughts, their own feelings, and that's okay because I have my own emotions, feelings, and thoughts. Okay. And this also is the basis of what makes our world predictable, right? So a question is there populations within the world that don't develop theory of mind? And to a partial extent, yes. For another group, absolutely. Okay. And so I'll bring up two groups that tend to have a difficult time with theory of mind. The first one, and I'll denote it with an A so I don't spend all the time trying to write it out, is children with autism. Okay. In research, about 70% of children who have been diagnosed with autism fail theory of mind tasks. But because it's not full, it's only 70%, we can't say that autism is caused by a broken theory of mind system, okay? One thing that we recognize is that this 70% tends to be children who are on the severe end of autism, and autism is a social relationship disorder, okay? Meaning that it's very difficult for children with autism to interact with other people. And so they get into stimulation behaviors to deal with that social interaction, okay? And we note that these children who fail at this theory of mind task tend to be at the extreme end of children with autism, which denotes again that this is a social disorder, and brings that to light, which we will get to when we near the end of the semester when we talk about disorders, okay? The other individuals that even as adults fail theory of mind tasks, and they fail it, most research, I know this is, I shouldn't put 100, I'm going to put 99, but we haven't found one that can pass this, is people who score very high in psychopathology, okay? And people who score high in psychopathology tend to be the individuals who are in prison for serial killings. Jeffrey Dahmer, I know there's a popular Netflix movie on him. He scores very high on the psychopathic checklist, which we'll go over too when we get to the abnormal section. What is a psychopath? Basics of a psychopath is it's individuals who use others to consume. They're unable to recognize the humanness in people. So they see other people as objects, as things to be consumed and used. Okay, that's the basic definition of psychopathology. And we have found that psychopaths fail both, I know this sounds weird, both the simple colorless dye experiment and experiments, which again, I think there's 8 to 16, I can't remember. And I know that there's 16 of the 2-cup variations of children's, of the 2-cup experiments, recognizing that one, they don't have a basic concept of the self that is separate from others, and they don't recognize others as having a unique mind of their own that's separate from them. So those are two kind of clinical populations that we could look at to denote, is there people who do not develop theory of mind? Yes, there are. And we do know that there's great variability in the general population, there are people who have very weak mirror neuroning systems and very weak mentalizing systems. These are people who we tend to, again, if I go clinically, these are people who tend to be, more on the narcissistic side. And then there's people who are very strong in the mirror neuroning and mentalizing system. These are people who are very highly sensitive and tuned to their social world. And again, that brings with it its own certain level of dysfunction when we're at those extremes. But the majority of us, again, lay here somewhere in the middle where we have a developed mirror neuroning and mentalizing system, which makes us quite well at these theory of mind tasks. Okay, so that's theory one that I wanted to make sure we covered in the child in the early childhood. And I'm going to look at Jordan's question. Do we know why people do not develop this? Is it genetic or environmental? Jordan, the debate is still out on that. When we look at, for example, psychopathology, we know that there is a family history of pathology within a family. But there hasn't been an identified genetic marker. So we can see it through family history, that there is some type of heritability of psychopathology as an example, but we haven't yet found any genetic markers. What probably lends most to the idea that it's a mixture between both is that most of the individuals who are severely psychopathic had very traumatic childhoods. And so we're thinking it's more of a trigger effect. I'll bring up Dahmer again because he's popular on Netflix. On his mother's side, he had a severe history of mental illness, dealing with things like delusional thinking and schizotype disorders within his mother. So there was that genetic kind of propensity towards many of the things that Dahmer did. But on his father's side, we see a father who, though he tried, he was very emotionally unavailable to Dahmer. And so with that, we see a genetic, but we also see that environmental issue. So answer your question, Jordan, is we think right now that it's an interaction between the two. Yeah, so that's kind of where it is right at the moment. So we do know that through some training programs in theory of mind that there can be some environmental contingencies that can improve theory of mind through training programs. And so we do know that there is some environmental issues there because it can be partially trained if it's trained in this 24 to 36 month period. Training programs of theory of mind after 36 months tends not to be very successful at all. So, okay, with that being said, and thank you, Jordan, that was a really good question. Let me know, is everybody understanding this concept of theory of mind? Is there any other questions? Okay, thank you, Jacob. Jordan. Okay, all right. Abby, thank you. Okay. Benjamin, in its most basic level, yes, it is the ability to relate and develop relationships with others. Yeah, the most basic definition would be that. Okay. So another concept that I want to hit on when we're talking about early childhood is temperament. Okay. Now, when we get into the personality section, we will look at things like genetic quotients, about how much of personality is determined by genetics versus experience. Okay. And so, for example, I'll go back to whether you're introverted or extroverted. Depending on what research you read, that there's a range that some research suggests that 20% of extroversion, introversion is genetic. Other research shows as much as 60 to 70% is genetically determined. So we know, at least from the literature we have, that things like extroversion and introversion is genetically determined between 20 to 60%, somewhere around there. And then as we move along with our studies of genetics and behavioral genetics, I'm hoping that we will refine those percentages, but that's kind of where we're at right now. But there is one personality trait that is inarguably completely genetically determined, and that is a person's temperament. Okay. Temperament is the general emotional style an individual displays in response to experience in the world. So in its most basic terms, temperament is whether you quickly emotionally respond to stimuli. So if you're quick to anger, if you're quick to surprise, if emotion, you tend to be a very emotionally driven person, that is what we call a quick or hot temperament. Okay. Individuals who are kind of like the laid back, very mellow, things that it looks like emotions hit them and it just kind of runs off their body. That's a very low temperament. It's a person who is not very emotionally reactive to the world. Okay. And that's a basic type of temperament. Okay. Now the question is one temperament better or good? Well, wait a minute. I've been told this before. Wait a minute. My dad had a really hot temper, and I feel like I don't. I do want to explain something that because temperament is a born trait, many people are able to live with and control their temperaments. So if you have a really hot temperament, but you had a very good developmental history in your childhood where you were able to experience a lot of things, you learned how to deal with or cope with having a very hot temperament. Okay. It's children who tend to end up having things like aggression issues, acting out issues because of their temperament. It's usually they were raised in a very chaotic environment where mom and dad were not involved very much. And that's where we see temperament in children having a negative influence on the individual. So temperament is set biologically, but environmental experiences teach us how to deal with our temperament as it is. Okay. Now, from research back in '99, and we found that within early childhood, there's about 3 temperamental styles that we should review really quick. The first one is what is an easy temperament, and it's marked by positive mood, easy adaptation to change, regularity and predictability in patterns of eating, sleeping, and eliminating. This is the individual that if we put temperament on a hot to cold scale, they're the child that biologically are in the middle, and they have a good, strong developmental support. Okay. So, and then we have what is called slow to warm temperament. These are individuals who marked by more negative mood, intense responses. They have a difficulty with change and an irregular pattern of eating, sleeping, and eliminating. Okay. This is the child that, because they have to adapt to such negative moods and intense responses, really thrive in very consistent environments that they're very aware of and that are very predictable. So when they're put in a different environment that they're not commonly used to, they have a slow adaptation to it. They have to, this is a child that when they come visit, they kind of standoffish for a while. You can see their brains clicking, they're observing everything, and they're just trying to figure things out. And then eventually they will then slowly adapt into the environment and start playing with the other kids or whatnot. Okay. And we know that this is marked by the child's temperament, and again, the environmental contingencies that are put on that child, the supportive environment versus unsupportive, whether there's a lot of chaotic change within the child's world really determines this outcome. Okay. And then we know that there's children with a third style, which is a difficult temperament. This is marked by a slow adaptation to new experience and moderate irregularities in eating, sleeping, and eliminating. Difficult temperament children, when they do adapt to an environment, may not provide the accurate emotional responses to that environment. So it may be the child who is, let's say we're at a birthday party, and then they start getting involved in the birthday party, but then they're the ones that is very angry while everyone else is very happy. Okay. And so this is a child where their behaviors is not predictable by others, because again, if we look at this is the child in the with ultimate biology on their side and a good developmental setting. And then as we go down this, we end up with a child who probably comes from somewhat of an abusive environment. They probably got genetic predispositions from someone else who has a hot or quick temper. And it's probably the child that is always moving and whatnot. So they tend to have a difficult temperament. Okay. Now, these temperaments are important to note, especially when you're working with children or you have children of your own, is that you can't force a child to go from one of these two into this just because of the strong genetic predispositions in these temperament styles. But what you can help a child do is cope with these two type of temperament styles. And you can help others in their environment understand why, helping grandma understand why little Charlie doesn't instantly come up and give her a hug when Charlie comes and visits, and letting them know that it's not because the child doesn't like them, but the child has to warm up to that caregiver or that person. And this helps the child start to regulate their own emotions and their own temperament, and help them learn coping skills to deal with their temperamental style and their environmental contingencies. Okay. So this on the emotional end is temperament. And like I said, most psychologists and geneticists would agree that if there is one personality style that is determined by biology, it is temperament. Okay. Okay. And this table here, I think I posted this in here if you wanted to take a closer look at temperament. Kind of gives a temperament profile. You have difficulty, easy, dependent upon their quality and moods. So this is easy to slow to warm, and difficult, and kind of what you'd look at if, let's say, you were working with a child or wanted to look at your own children or nieces or nephews. Okay. So Anna, to get to your question, so temperament can either come from your mother or your father. And we usually do not have different temperamental styles. We have different ways of coping with our temperament in different situations. And so on the sibling question, so can you have more than one temperament? No, but you can have more than one adaptation style to a situation. So, someone who has a very quick temperament or a hot temperament may adapt very well in, example, the house setting, and they might not even notice their physiological arousal because they've developed skills to deal with it. and this can actually happen over a time period. I know my dad had a very hot temperament, so I remember him when he was younger, a younger father. He would throw stuff everywhere and get angry really quick. But then as he aged, that temperament, he still had that quick temper, but he then learned different ways to deal with that temperament. So he became what would look like a change in his temperament actually was a change in his reaction to the situation because of skills he developed. Okay. But in my example, my temperament didn't come from my dad. My temperament came from my mom, which has a very slow temperament. Um, so yeah, does that answer your question, Nina? I want to make sure. Okay, you're welcome. Okay. Okay. So now the next thing we need to talk about is attachment and attachment theory. Okay, if you remember what Freud said, that early childhood is a very important developmental period. Okay, um, and him and people like Erickson very much focused on the relationship between the caregiver and the child. And even within Piaget's cognitive theory, he believed that the parent played a significant role in, for example, moral development of children, being able to set safe boundaries for a child to explore. So even within our cognitive theories, we see the importance of the relationship between the caregiver and the child, okay? And the question that has been asked is, how important is it to have a good, healthy attachment with your parents? How does it influence a child's development, and relationships into adulthood, which we will get to? Okay. So basically, as a definition, attachment is an emotional bond with a particular person. Okay. When we're talking about parent-child relationships, we think of parents as a secure base for exploration, for a child to go venture and explore, but know that that parent will be there. So these are two really basic examples that the infant is first going to be attached to the parent because they see them as that secure base. Okay. And there's three lines of research that we're going to look at. One is from Harry Harlow, the other is John Bowlby, and one is Mary Ainsworth. And to kind of give you the reason why these individuals started to research that, let's look at our theories first, okay? Early theories, such as those from Sigmund Freud and the behaviorist movement, believed infants attached to whoever nourished them, okay? So attachment was just based upon the sustenance from mother's breasts, okay, basically. And what Freud and behaviorists are going to argue is that the only thing that a mother really needs to provide is the nourishment, okay? And then of course changing and blanketing the child became secondary, okay? Now, I think I've mentioned in this class before about Freud and the behaviorists influencing on parenting, because this still has a pretty negative consequence today. There are still pediatricians who tell parents that, you know, give them what's called the cry out method, where children need to learn self-reliance and self-determination by controlling their own little tiny emotions, and that unless the baby needs to be fed or changed, just let the baby cry, leave it alone, let it be. I'm going to tell you that in all good research on child development, that even though it's medical doctors who are pediatricians giving this kind of advice, it is false, wrong, and anyone who falls into that mess is going to have a more difficult child in later childhood. Indeed, what research has shown is that children need more than what Sigmund Freud and the behaviorist argued, which we'll get to here in just a minute. But get off my soapbox for a minute. But I just wanted to say that this idea that the only thing a mother needs to provide is nourishment, that is a Freudian or a behaviorist attitude, which, if you remember, Freud was not based very much in science, and the behaviorists, well, you know, they have their own set of issues as well. Okay. But around 1958, a gentleman by the name of Harry Harlow was very dissatisfied with this idea that the only quality that a parent should be providing a child is just nourishment, but there has to be something else going on. And so he did a series of research dealing with macaque monkeys, where he decided to test this notion of whether an infant just needs nourishment from the parent or if they need something else. And so he raised baby macaque monkeys in an environment where the little monkey had two options. It could go to a wired monkey that just had a bottle attached to it, the nourishment condition, okay? Or it could spend time with the mother who had a terry cloth who provided warmth and comfort, okay? And Harlow was interested in what does the infant monkey, where does it spend the majority of its time? And indeed, what Harlow found is the little monkey had a preference for the terry cloth mother. Okay, indeed, in a lot of the situations, the little monkey would wait to the point of starvation before it would walk over to the mother who had the milk and feed from the milk. And he also found that in certain conditions, so example, when the monkey was frightened, the baby would run to the terry cloth mother for physical comfort, not the wired mother, which if the only important thing about attachment was the nourishment mother provided, that in the frightening condition, the monkey, if that was accurate, should have went to the nourishing mother, not the terry cloth mother. So here's evidence one that there's a more important thing going on between mommies and babies in development, okay? In another condition that Harlow ran is that in some conditions, the only thing that was provided to the little infant monkey was the wired mom. Okay, that was it. There was no terry cloth mother. There was no exposure to a real actual mother. And what Harlow wanted to know is what would happen when that little monkey needed to start to socialize and socialize with the other, I forget what they're called, the other group. Okay, I can't remember the name of a cluster of monkeys that work together. I can't remember. Now I'll tell you right away that monkeys who were raised with the terry cloth mother, and then they went into the environment, they were accepted by the group, and they tended to have they even though they didn't have their social skills very developed, they eventually caught up with the other monkeys. Okay. But for little monkeys who were just raised with nourishment, that with a mother who just nourished them but didn't do any other interaction, these monkeys, when put into the social situation, experience two things. One, they themselves spent most of their time alone. And the other part is they tended to be bullied by the other monkeys. The other monkeys, in a sense, if you want to put it in human terms or anthropomorphic terms, bullied them physically and indeed emotionally. And in some cases, the other monkeys would beat that monkey to death. And so not only did the monkey in this situation not know how to socialize, somehow the other socialized monkeys didn't like it. They rejected the monkey through bullying behaviors and sometimes even violence. Okay, so I will tell you that, remember, this was 1958. This was before the time of ethics, and as you could imagine, this type of research would not be very well accepted in our modern times, but it does tell us something very important about the relationship between the caregiver and the child, and that it's more than just providing physical necessities for a child. There's something else that is going on there, and that's what we can get from Harlow's studies. Based on Harlow's studies, he came up with some basic attachment styles from further research that he did, and he brought about this idea of the development of attachment. And he kind of put it in kind of 4 phases. And the first one is pre-attachment. This is where you get joined attention. Remember what I talked about with I'm going to use mothers. This definitely can occur with fathers or other primary caregivers. But this is where mom, feeds the baby, and they have that reciprocal moment of a smile here, smile that, and that comforting feeling. This is that joint attention stage where we start to realize each other. In the attachment in making, this is when an infant starts to have preference for mom. So I mentioned that around 6 weeks to about 6 months, infants will start to have a preference for the color of mom's skin, the sound of mom's voice, the smell of mom's odor. And when they get into situations that are different from that, we start to see the mark of stranger anxiety, that the further and further away you get from the stimulation of mom, the more anxious the child becomes with that individual. And then we see clear-cut attachment phase occurring between this time period of about 8 months to 24 months, where the primary caregiver leaves the child with someone who's a stranger. Maybe it's a grandparents for the first time, and the child has an anxiety response, usually denoted by a few minutes of crying, or dependent on their temperament style, it can go very badly. And then around 18 months of age, we get to goal-corrected partnerships, where the infant starts to recognize that they have an active role in their relationship, and they start to develop this, what we call an internal working model of attachment, where they start to say, okay, when I do something wrong, this is the most basic version of this. When I do something wrong to hurt mom, I need to apologize. When mom does something wrong to hurt me, mom needs to apologize to me, and that's how we correct our relationship. So this was based on the work of Harlow, and he kind of, and again, it's kind of, the issue with Harlow is that a lot of his research was done with species, and he kind of anthropomorphized it into what we should see with humans and what he recognized with young children. Research with children is going to start with the work of Bowlby and Ainsworth. And kind of to tell you the relationship between John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, John Bowlby is going to come up with the human attachment theory. Ainsworth is going to be the person who tests and refines that theory. So these individuals are aiming to test attachment with humans, human infants, and to really see if there is different types of attachment based on the relationship or the type of parenting the parent gives. And again, in the early years, I'll use mothers because a lot of the research was originally done with moms. So basically, and I'll give a preview to this. So what Bowlby came up with is this attachment style here, based on his observations of young children. And if we look at it, if we look at it from a basis, up here is the best type of attachment, a nice secure attachment. And as we go down the list, the attachment style becomes more and more disconnected, and it has more of a developmental impact on the child. Okay. So, but the question is how valid was this test or this theory? And this is where Ainsworth came in, and she came up with what's called the strange situation experiments. Okay. And what Ainsworth sought to do with the strange situation experiments is wanted to see how infants use their mothers as a secure base for exploration, and how infants use mothers to calm down after being stressed by a separation. Okay, so in the strange situation experiment, the mom brings the child to the lab where there's a playroom usually, and there's one of two conditions. Either the mom leaves the child alone, or that she leaves the child with a stranger, a confederate for the experiment. Okay. And what Ainsworth was interested in is how would the child respond when the parent would return. Okay. And then what Ainsworth and a little bit of Bowlby did is they went back and they looked at the different type of interactions children's had. And then they did interviews with the mothers about their mothering style. Okay. And this is where these types of attachment came with. So a child who has a secure attachment, and for the sake of time, I'm just going to compare disorganized and disoriented with secure. And please go back to the slides if you're interested in more of this. You can look at these different styles. Okay, so child who is secure. The parent leaves, the parent comes back, and the child seeks out the caregiver and is easily soothed by the caregiver. And the key thing is easily soothed by the caregiver. Okay. And when the caregiver is present, the child feels the ability that they can freely explore in the presence of the caregiver. They can go and they can start playing with toys very easily, and is able to do that in the presence of the caregiver when the caregiver returns. Okay. And what they found with interviews, that infants with a secure attachment tended to the early mothering is the mother was very responsive to the infant and the infant's needs. So again, going back to the Erickson's example, this is where I had the example, the baby cries, the mom shows up, feeds, comforts, and then baby cries, mom comes, changes, all of that responsive interaction between the mother and the child. Okay. So if we were to put this in Erickson's terms, this would be trust, right? Okay. Now, as we go to the bottom, we'll kind of hit this one, the disorganized or disoriented child. This is a child who tends to be very insecure and kind of disorganized in their response to parents. So for the example, in the strange situation, when the mother returns in this situation, sometimes the child would go to the caregiver. But usually it was interesting. It wasn't going up and just hugging the caregiver and being into the caregiver. They would usually be kind of looking away and kind of like, okay, yeah, you're here. How's it going, mom? Give me 5 or something like that. Or they would have an expression of fear and daze, like, oh, you're here. Am I doing something wrong? This is, when we go back to Erickson's, this is that idea of shame and the like. Okay. When the parent was present, the child sometimes may have frozen. They wouldn't be able to. The experimenter or the parent would say, go play, and the child would just simply freeze in space and not move. Okay. And if they did go explore, they did it in a very disorganized fashion. They kind of went and kind of did something over there and didn't do anything constructive with it. And they'd go over to another place because in a sense, they just weren't sure what they should actually be doing in that environment. Okay. And then again, interviews with this parent is, we found that there was a lot of intrusiveness on the part of the parent. There tended to be a lot of maltreatment, both physically and emotionally. The parent tended to be emotionally unavailable. They tend to focus on the mother's emotions more than the child's emotions. And they tend to confuse and frighten the child. Again, if we go back to that Erickson's example, this is where the mother came in a rage saying, hey, what do you need? I'm out here doing my thing. I'm busy. What the hell do you need now? That kind of response, if the parent responded at all. Okay. All right, so this is that example of mistrust when we were talking about the Erickson model. Okay. Now, just to kind of talk about factors that influence different attachment styles, is that it can be produced by a numerous number of factors. We find that mothers being more sensitive and responsive can develop a more predictive of a secure and insecure attachment style. Fathers being sensitive is also important. We find that fathers who are available and who are present tend to have infants or young children who have more of a secure temperament style. And again, this is why I presented the idea of temperament, is temperaments help determine sensitivity to parental response. So this is, again, the parent needs to learn their child's temperament and how to respond to it. And then infantile colic, this is infants who seem to cry a lot and cry with no reason, also influences an infant's attachment style, okay? And we know that biology plays a role. So higher levels of oxytocin on the biological end tend to have more children from birth, tend to have more secure types of attachments. We know culture plays a role. So when we talk about American versus and North American versus Israel, Korea, and Japan, we see attachment styles here in America that are more individualistic in nature, meaning that we tend to take a lot of responsibility for our successes and our failures, and we tend to take on that responsibility, saying that we ourselves are responsible. And we find that this produces more of an avoidant or an insecure, not always questioning ourselves of whether we're doing is right or wrong, okay? Whereas when we look at more collectivistic societies, meaning societies where the individual's responsibility is more towards their community or their family than it is to themselves. So in this situation, if I fell, my community fails. If my community fails, I fell. If I succeed, my community succeeds. If my community succeeds, I succeed. So there's this, instead of this idea that everything is based on me, there's this responsibility to community. We see that more anxious versus ambivalent styles, meaning more, I'm not sure if what I'm doing is right or wrong, or I'm just going to be ambivalent about it, tends to be a higher mark for that group, okay? So again, we started with the question, does attachment style have anything to do with later life situations, okay? And we do find that attachment is predictive of adults' ability to maintain secure relationships later in life. But it's a more complicated story, okay? Because what we have found is attachment in early childhood determines the type of friendships and relationships a child is going to have in their later childhood peer years. And we actually have found that those peer relationships are what are predictive of later life relationships. So it's kind of this kind of gateway to the type of relationships we're going to have with peers. And then we note that at our relationships in our adolescent years is more predictive of later romantic relationships. So it's not a direct association. Okay. The other things that we do know that is that our attachment styles are not fixed. New life circumstances can change secure attachments to insecure and from insecure to secure. So as I said, peer relationships are actually more predictive than infant attachment styles. Because we have found that whether a child had, regardless of having a secure attachment or an insecure attachment, their relationships with their peers, whether they're rejected or accepted, the type of people that accept them versus reject them, really can change an individual's attachment style. Okay. We know that we can do interventions to change an attachment style, and the like. So domestic violence, for example, or dating violence can change an attachment style. Okay. So life events play an important role, but there is this association that infants' attachment style sets up how we'll relate with our peers. And then it's our relationships with our peers where we'll learn kind of how we're going to relate with romantic relationships later in life. So that's kind of the roadmap. Okay. And I talked a little bit just to kind of move on more with attachment style. I apologize. I'm trying to get us through this so that we can start talking about the other lifespan stuff next week. Is that we know that the reason why these attachment styles matter is they develop our internal working models of relationships with others. So we know that children who tend to have a secure attachment tend to, I can trust and rely on others. They feel that they're capable of love and significant worth, and that their world is safe. And again, I'll go down. Again, you can look at these tables in the presentation I posted. When we go down here, the internal working model is my caregiver at times seems overwhelmed by me, and other times seems very angry at me. Others, the working model is others are abusive, neglectful, physically, emotionally, and sometimes sexually. And I'm unable to get my needs met with other people. I don't know how to protect myself. So these, again, this all deals with the relationship between the caregiver and the child. And I think one of the biggest misnomers about children's misbehavior is that this assumption that it has to deal with the child and not their family system. And I'm going to bring this up in the notion of attachment disorders. And I want to talk about the treatment of attachment disorders. Attachment disorders is when a child is so, put it non-tactfully, out of whack. They tend to be aggressive. They tend to be act out very easily. They tend to harm other people. They tend to be very disengaged and not seem to be able to integrate with their world. And this is consistent across situations, not just with, you know, you hear about the child who kind of acts out with mom and dad, but is an angel with grandma and grandpa. Okay, no, the child with what we call an attachment disorder tends to have that same acting out regardless of who they're with. So, and there's about two different types of attachment disorders. There's disinhibition social engagement disorder. And this is an attachment disorder in which children approaches strangers indiscriminately, not differentiating between attachment figures or others. Okay. All right. So this is a child who is so disengaged with their world that they just go up to anybody, and will go with anybody. Okay, and they don't differentiate between those who are safe for them and those who are not. Reactive attachment disorder, which is a more common disorder, is a disorder marked by the inability to form attachments with caregivers. So this is a child who tends to either be very, very aggressive towards caregivers, tends to hit, slap, bite, and are very hard to calm down, and they act out a lot. Or this is a child who is like very, very clingy to a single caregiver. This is the child who can't be left alone. And they singularly cling to one individual. Okay. All right. And the question is this treatable? And I had a good colleague of mine who actually did attachment disorder treatment, and it is. But just like what we find with most disorders with children, the treatment doesn't focus on the child, it focuses on the caregivers. He said that dealing with children with attachment disorders, about 95% of the treatment is with the caregiver, and only about 5% is with the actual child. And when it is with the actual child, it's modeling how the caregivers should be responding to the child. Okay. And we have found that attachment disorder treatment is very, very effective taking on that model. We find that individual types of attachment, individual types of therapies, such as working mostly with just the child, are largely ineffective, and really don't get anywhere. I think the interesting thing about attachment disorders and why it's important to really work with children when they're young is my colleague also said that at the age of 8, if a child still is having symptoms of either RAD or the disinhibition social engagement disorder, that treatment for attachment disorder stops at the age of 8, because research has clearly shown that if the symptoms of attachment disorder are not resolved by the age of 8, there's no amount of treatment that is going to help that child. Okay. In fact, what the treatment guidelines suggest is that after the age of 8, it becomes a life management issue. It doesn't become a treatment issue. And indeed, what we find, and we'll explore this a little bit more when we get into abnormal psychology, is often attachment disorder leads to childhood conduct disorder, which child conduct disorder, if not managed, I'm using the word managed, not treated, because it's a management issue. If it's not managed, conduct disorder tends to then result in what's called antisocial personality disorder. And this is where we get people who aggress against society, aggress against the world, okay? And so that's kind of the trajectory and why we should pay attention to these early attachment issues, especially when we have children who are having difficulties with it. All right, we covered a lot of information today, and we've taken up the majority of our time in class today. So I'm just going to ask, does anybody have any questions from the content that we went over today? Thank you, Jacob. Thank you, Emma. Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Alexis. We spent a lot of time today, and there's a lot of information to absorb. And so let's go ahead and close up for our Friday. I hope everybody enjoys their Friday evening and the rest of your day, and you have a wonderful weekend. And we will continue our conversation this coming Wednesday. Take care, everyone.